Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition. My name is Peggy Bentley, and I'm SISN's president. It is a pleasure to moderate today the webinar titled A Virtual Training of Trainers, Adaptations from COVID-19. As some of you may recall, in August, SISN put out a call inviting our community to submit a webinar proposal to share their knowledge and experiences of optimizing implementation during this unprecedented time. I'm grateful that Chelsie Kolberg and her colleagues from Rise Against Hunger responded to this call and are here today to share with us their work that is very much in progress. In a few moments, they will present a case study of implementing training videos in a nutrition-sensitive agriculture project at a school in South Sudan. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and I will pose as many of the questions as possible. If you experience any technical issues, please also type your questions in the question box. Our staff will help you address these. We're also active on Twitter and encourage you to chat and engage with us through our Twitter hashtag, which will appear in the chat box. Finally, a recording of the webinar will be made available after the session. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chelsie Kolberg and Bryan Pride. Chelsie Kolberg has her master's in public health from UNC Chapel Hill and is a registered dietitian working in international food security and nutrition programs with Rise Against Hunger. She utilizes social and behavior change communications in nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs, advises on nutrient quality of distributed and locally procured foods, and writes a monthly blog-style post to inform the organization of relevant nutrition topics. Chelsie believes that international programming should remove barriers and allow locals to drive their own development. She looks to reform and challenge existing structures of West knows best ideologies, both within herself and the world around her. Bryan Pride holds a master's in public policy, focusing on sustainable development and agriculture from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Currently, Bryan is a Mickey Leland International Hunger Fellow. For his fellowship, Bryan works as the Agriculture and Nutrition Security Advisor for Rise Against Hunger. Prior to Bryan's fellowship, he served on the USAID-funded RING project as an agriculture technical advisor. Bryan has designed and implemented agriculture and nutrition programs that have reached more than 3,000 women and participants in Ghana alone. Bryan approaches international development from the mindset that local leaders are the most valuable assets to program design and implementation. His fieldwork experience has led him to develop research focusing on how culture influences both nutrition and food security. Bryan's goal is to reshape how international development agencies approach food security programming. So now over to you, Chelsie and Bryan.
What a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Peggy. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm assuming that my audio is still working. You can just give me a yes in the chat box. But I am Chelsie Kolberg. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm the Nutrition Technical Advisor with Rise Against Hunger. And with me today is my wonderful colleague.
Hey, I am Bryan, and it is also a pleasure to be here.
We want to say thank you to SISN for accepting us and giving us this platform to share our changes in programming. So today's presentation is a case study, like Peggy said, but it's also an example of how we're looking to change the way development is done. We also want to challenge you, the attendees, to go out and find ways to disrupt the current methodology. As an industry, we've been fighting hunger for decades, but we haven't made much progress. We need to change how we work. So we want today to be a work in progress discussion to showcase how our organization reacts when a crisis hits and what that means for other implementers. It is not a spotlight on a huge success story by any means. In fact, this is the first chapter of what could be a flop. Do we nail it or fail it? But failure is necessary for growth, and fearing failure will keep us stuck in the same old practices. This is not meant to be the end of the conversation either. We welcome feedback and are open to further conversation after today's session is over. Our contact information will be shared at the end. So before we really start, we want to get a feel for who's here. So on your screen, there'll be a poll. And please respond to what is your role related to international development and implementation science? Are you an implementer, field officer, researcher, scientist, policy leader, government official? Are you a donor agency, or are you not involved in international work? Okay, thanks so much for doing that, and that will inform our discussion later after the session today. So attending these webinars, I often wonder what's in it for me. So we're going to have some discussion at the end about how you can shake up the system. And we want to encourage that conversation with starting with these learning goals. So at the end of today's presentation, you'll be able to discern alternative methods to implementing programs, recognize how implementation practices can be dynamic in the face of crises like COVID-19, and explore methods to empower local communities to drive their own development. So here's our agenda for today. We'll begin with a bit of history and context about Rise Against Hunger, who we are, and the work that we're doing in South Sudan. We'll then talk about COVID-19 and the pivot, where we are going next with this project and these videos, and how it relates to implementation science and unpacking the black box. So I want to remind everyone again that Bryan and I are programs people. We are not research people. So know that we approach everything from that lens. This is a map of South Sudan. It's taken from FuseNet, which is a famine early warning system. And you can see that South Sudan ranges from stressed to emergency. And our story takes place in Eastern Equatoria. It is in a stage 3 crisis. FuseNet predicts that acute food insecurity could quickly deteriorate if flooding or insecurity significantly delayed deliveries of food. We heard from our on-the-ground school director last night that there's been a lot of flooding recently and that the fields are flooded as well as the roads to town. So a scale up in food assistance is required to save lives.
Our story takes place just outside of Torit, South Sudan, which, as you can tell from this map, is in the southern area of South Sudan. And I want to provide some context on our location. South Sudan is a newly formed country and gained its independence from Sudan in July of 2011. The desire to be independent stemmed from the extreme instances of wealth stratification as well as racial and ethnic oppression. South Sudan's fight for independence is Africa's longest war, spanning a total of 20 years. Before the war, Torit was a bolstering city filled with merchants, small businesses, but is now a city in partial ruins with dilapidated buildings, limited functioning infrastructure, and displaced individuals from various conflicts. Despite the obvious destruction, Torit is rebuilding its stability, and much of that is owed to the local organizations. Today, Chelsie and I will tell you a story about Hope for South Sudan, which is one of the local organizations helping to stabilize Torit. Next slide, please. There are several actors that are involved in the story that we're sharing today. And first, we're going to start with Rise Against Hunger, which is the agency that Chelsie and I work with. Rise started as a food distribution organization about 25 years ago and is based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Food is packaged in the US and is then shipped to insecure areas around the world. Most meals go to schools and hospitals. Hope for South Sudan has been receiving meals from Rise Against Hunger for the past year. Within Rise Against Hunger is the Empowering Communities portfolio, and through these Empowering Communities portfolios, we work to transition communities that receive our meals onto sustainable agriculture projects in order to remove the need to receive meals from Rise Against Hunger. The Empowering Communities team is working with our partner Lift Up the Vulnerable, or as we call them, LOVE, to implement a nutrition smart agriculture project in South Sudan. Lift Up the Vulnerable is based in New York, and they're an organization that prevents trafficking and oppression of vulnerable women and children in conflict zones. Lift Up the Vulnerable is the primary funder and supporter of Hope for South Sudan. Hope for South Sudan is a locally run children's home and school that provides meals, clothes, and education to 400 children that have lost their parents in the various conflicts. In addition to supporting school children, Hope for South Sudan also supports 100 staff members that have similar stories of hardship. Hope for South Sudan has provided stability for both individuals at the school and in the surrounding communities of Torit for the last 13 years. Due to their dedication to create stability, Hope for South Sudan is viewed as a safe haven by many of the community members. Understanding that neither Lift Up the Vulnerable nor Rise Against Hunger could support Hope for South Sudan indefinitely, all parties agreed that it was time for Hope for South Sudan to become self-sustained, and this meant two things for us. First, we needed to ensure that Hope for South Sudan could grow nutritious foods on campus for consumption to remove the need for packaged meals from Rise Against Hunger. And second, we needed to ensure that Hope for South Sudan could become economically independent from Lift Up the Vulnerable. The decision to support Hope for South Sudan on this journey of obtaining their full independence is what brought me to Torit, South Sudan earlier this year. Next slide, please. In March 2020, I visited Hope for South Sudan for the first time to scope the location of the school and conduct a basic needs and skill assessment with Peter, who's the director of the school, and can be seen in the photo on the right. The school and children's home sits on about 500 acres of land, but only 7 acres were being cultivated. The agriculture staff at the school was comprised of only 3 individuals, making it very challenging to cultivate more land than that was already being cultivated. Peter, the Hope for South Sudan agriculture and kitchen staff all agreed that there was a need to increase the use of the land at the school. Thus, we began to plan an agriculture and nutrition project. After collecting information and planning, Peter and the staff at the school helped create the early stages of what we would soon know and call the Empowering Leaders Through Nutrition Smart Agriculture Project, or ELNA, as we like to call it for short. However, in the midst of all this great planning, COVID-19 took the world by storm, and I was quickly evacuated from South Sudan, unable to finish some of the work that we had started. Next slide, please.
When Bryan was there in March, he was WhatsApping me messages and pictures of what he was eating every day. And he also sent me pictures of serving materials so that I had a sense of what and how much the children at the school were eating. So I put together this chart. And during the dry season, Hope for South Sudan receives Rise Against Hunger meals to cover 2 meals a week. This is how that process goes. The meals are delivered by truck on dangerous unpaved roads that we heard from our school director last night are now flooded. And transporters risk their safety from the elements as well as robbers. And this year, a new mandatory COVID-19 testing fee of $65 was levied against cargo truck drivers. Traders importing goods from surrounding countries report delays by about 6 days, according to REACH data. You can see here that Rise Against Hunger meals are not complemented with other foods when they're served. That's important for the next slide. The rest of the time, the children eat a starch-heavy breakfast, a very small amount of animal products, overcooked greens, and very few protein and oil foods. Throughout the year, this doesn't change much in composition, but it might change in amounts. As prices vary in South Sudan, Love provides what they can. In serious local shortages, Love flies in food from Kenya, which is expensive. You guys, these are 1 propeller planes with limited weight capacity, so sometimes several trips are necessary. You can see here that dietary diversity is low and serving sizes are small. On the top right is a picture Bryan sent me of the serving bowls and cups. The bottom right shows images of the size of a meal. These are relatively small portions. On the left is a chart showing the nutrient analysis of 1 serving of Rise Against Hunger meals. The vertical dashed line is the goal for 1 meal. The green bars are macronutrients, the blue bars minerals, and the purple vitamins. The meal is lacking in overall calories, protein, and fat, as well as some choice micronutrients. With growing bodies and brains, it's obvious that these children need higher quality diets.
So one of the key elements of the ELNA project is that we're implementing an initiative in real time of the seasons, meaning we need to sow seeds when it's raining because that's their form of irrigation. Chelsie and I started to look for ways on how we could adapt our programming to comply with these new challenges and realities of COVID-19. Our solution was to make the Training of Trainers program virtual. And our hope was that by making this virtual training program, we would be able to prevent COVID-19 from bottlenecking the project and maintain the implementation schedule that was aligned with the seasons as originally planned. Next slide.
So how did we really decide to do videos? This is where the implementation science comes in. Implementation science is the process to improve how you do your intervention. It looks at these 5 domains that influence your implementation. So number 1, our object. Well, we're doing a nutrition sensitive agriculture program that incorporates behavior change communication to break barriers identified by the people who experience them. Next, we looked at implementing organizations and staff, which is us, Rise Against Hunger, Lift Up the Vulnerable, and then Hope for South Sudan. Next, we looked at the enabling environment. We cannot ignore that South Sudan is a country with a history of conflict. It's a new country with limited governance. There are also several foreign actors at play in South Sudan, so how does our work reduce redundancy and add value? Next, we looked at the individuals, households, and communities involved in the project. What is the literacy level of staff? These children are displaced and without parents, so the school is their legal guardian. There are likely several conflicting tribes represented at this school. We know that there's a great desire to learn from staff at Hope for South Sudan. And looking at resources we had in the project, we already had tablets. This was key. We're using these tablets as a data collection device. So we thought, why not double dip and also use these tablets as a training device? And finally, we looked at the implementation processes. We need to be collaborative in our approach to initiate, plan, implement, and then sustain this program. Here's how this works. So keeping in line with implementation science principles, we want to mobilize existing knowledge. We know that training of trainers programs works, but how do we do that in a virtual world? So at the top, we have our lead farmer, or right now it's probably Peter, who's the school director, who has the videos and has assistance from us. He will then train school staff who can disseminate knowledge either through school curriculum or to community leaders or other school staff. And then the students and community leaders can continue sharing that knowledge, not just within the school, but outside of the school in a farmer field school program. We actually heard feedback from our school director last night that these videos are clear, the language is simple, and the fact that they're text-free and they're just audio narrating visual actions is the best option. So, as I said earlier, this is a work in progress. Right now, we have 3 videos completed, edited, translated, downloaded, and in the hands of the school director on the ground. We also are expecting some feedback in the next few weeks as he pilots these videos with locals so that we can improve the process for the next batch. Already, we have learned some things in this process. Some things we realized early on include resources available are different in the US compared to South Sudan, which may seem obvious, but just look at this photo from our filming. When we were filming, it was a rainy day, we needed a flat wall to show proper technique in taking height, and we needed good lighting to produce a quality video. But does this look anything like the school at Hope for South Sudan? No. The soil is also different from North Carolina to South Sudan. And from experiential knowledge, we know that seeing is believing when it comes to working in agriculture in Africa. Will these factors influence the adoption of the technique? We'll find out together. The next thing we learned is that turnaround time on videos is high. which leads to the next point. We really need to be filming seasonally, as Bryan said, so that the videos align with the practice. But that means we have to film them a season early so that there's time to edit, translate, deliver, and train before they need to be done. To tackle this, we're doing a batch process. So if you're familiar with the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle in quality improvement, it's kind of what we're doing. It's a way to do continuous improvement throughout while delivering good implementation. So as we're going to be doing batch video filming. So during one season, we'll film a batch of videos, and as those are being implemented and trained upon, we're receiving feedback. So we can continuously incorporate feedback throughout the year, and each new cycle of videos should build on quality from the one before. So what are the next steps with these videos? Well, short term, we have to use them in this project, right? So we're creating and filming a filming timeline to align with the seasons. So as I said, the first 3 videos are downloaded and in the hands of our partner, so we await their feedback. At the same time, here, we need to connect with local organizations that have ties to South Sudan to aid in the translation and representation in the videos. Representation is important. During the course of the project, we will implement the virtual training of trainers with the continuous improvement over the next 5 years. But long term, we have big dreams. We recognize that COVID is not going anywhere, and so doing a virtual training of trainers program makes sense in other areas of the world and in other projects we're involved in. Because these videos have no text, the idea is to change the narration from language to language as it needs. So we hope to scale up these videos to other projects, and we hope that that limits the presence of external organizations while providing resources to locals to lead their own development. If we can remove barriers and share tools, then our presence becomes unnecessary. And maybe this can change the way global programming is done.
Now that Chelsie and I have gone through the process of how we had to change and adapt our approach to implementing the ELNA project, we want to take a step back and visit the CISN framework of the black box of implementation. The black box framework lets us as implementers question how to transform nutrition intervention ideas into tangible results of that intervention. When it comes to program implementation, a lot of repeated mistakes are made when projects transition off paper and materialize into physical results. These mistakes occur because this black box of implementation is hiding the answer of how to implement projects. Chelsie and I believe that if we can learn what's inside the box, then we can finally learn how to implement projects with fewer mistakes and hopefully achieve our Sustainable Development 2 goals. Next slide, please. Well, Chelsie and I are also just naturally curious people, and we decided that we wanted to take this black box and we wanted to open it up. And when we opened it up, we learned a few things about how projects are currently being implemented. One of the first things that we pulled out of the black box is we realized that there's a mentality that we value that the West knows best, and that is favored over local knowledge in the areas that we're working. There's an unequal divide between local leaders and expats. Expats are often held at a higher status, which leads to the exclusion of local leaders when it comes to making decisions about programming and implementation. The second thing that we found inside of the box was that there's a strong promotion for top-down versus bottom-up approaches. Donors and headquarter offices oftentimes dictate processes of implementation to the on-the-ground teams. This action also excludes local leaders from contributing ideas to best practices, and this prevents these leaders from being able to provide contextual knowledge and insight that is necessary and important for implementation practices. The third thing that we found is that oftentimes we act with static implementation rather than dynamic implementation. Static implementation is implementing programs based on predetermined schedules. The schedules have little to no flexibility once implementation has started. Implementation schedules are often based on financial calendars, not agricultural calendars. Dynamic implementation is when we're able to implement programs while remaining flexible to alter the project based on findings and needs that arise during the implementation process. Each of these items that we pulled out of the black box have impacts on how programs are implemented and their success. When poor decisions are made during the implementation process, such as excluding local leaders, it becomes harder to obtain the goals of the project. More often than not, the exclusion of local leaders shifts the focus of the project away from supporting communities and towards a focus that is primarily centered around data. COVID-19 has forced many NGOs and international development agencies to rethink our actions and find new ways to approach international development and our implementation. For those of us working in international development, now is the time for us to reflect on how our agencies operate and ask what changes we can make in order to ensure that we're effectively supporting projects and the communities. Next slide, please. As Chelsie and I reflected on the items that we pulled out of the box, we agreed that the instructions on how to implement a project shouldn't be hidden. So we decided that we were going to break down this box. And we're providing you with transparency on the philosophies that brought us to the decision to make the Training of Trainers program virtual, and how we supported our local leaders, such as Peter and the Hope for South Sudan staff, to design their own projects of implementations. The first philosophy that we want to share with you is the value of empowering local leaders. From the moment that I arrived in Torit, it was established that whatever programs we designed would be a collaborative effort with the local leaders. The local leaders are the ones who designed and are implementing the ELNA project. The use of the Training of Training videos supports Hope for South Sudan staff in accessing information about agriculture. They, the viewers, then become the teachers of the information to others, empowering the staff to lead and to be their own experts, free from dependence of agencies such as Rise Against Hunger, Lift Up the Vulnerable. The second philosophy that we want to share is the fact that we actively pre-prepared questions rather than solutions. I arrived in Torit with a list of questions about South Sudanese food, culture, crops, taboos, and weather patterns. The questions were the best means to understand what was needed in order to form a program. Many of us in the field consider ourselves to be problem solvers, but it's important to lead less with solutions and lead more with questions. Listening to the knowledge and insight of local leaders creates opportunities to exchange ideas about solution options rather than development agencies determining definitive solutions. The third philosophy that we're sharing is that we set clear and accurate expectations with donors. The virtual Training of Training program is a pilot. We aren't entirely sure of what the outcome may be, but we're running with the idea. As we continue to fundraise, it's necessary to communicate to donors what is and isn't possible and provide accurate reflections of activities being implemented. Maintaining open communication and clear expectation settings is what empowers local leaders to be dynamic implementers, free from restraints of those of us that are not on the ground. But the last philosophy that we use to help come up with our strategy is looking at the fact that program implementation needs to prioritize achieving project goals rather than prioritizing project data. The number one question we are often asked is, how will you measure the success? The success of the virtual Training of Training program will not be determined by how many people viewed the videos, but rather success will be determined if the viewers felt that they learned. The videos are a tool for us to help transfer information. The transfer of information is the key to implementation success. Next slide, please.
So we're hoping that this contributes to the body of work of implementation science so that others can analyze and make conclusions on the effectiveness of this model and look for ways to improve. Videos and programming could be a new model, but there is not much research on the topic. In the grand scheme of COVID, the FAO said in the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World for this year that we need to shorten market chains to bring food closer to consumers. We need to refocus on diet quality rather than quantity, and that the current status quo isn't working. we are not close to achieving our SDG goals. The way we do programming needs to change. By using these training videos, the leaders of the school are able to learn nutrition-smart agriculture practices and then become the trainer to community members. Building the capacity of local leaders empowers those leaders to be regarded as capable and points of knowledge by other community members. That shift of local leaders being regarded as community experts helps combat the negative stigma of host country nationals not being capable of leading their own development. We want these videos to serve as a lighthouse to other virtual implementers. We're all working from home right now, so let's collaborate on our approach and work to make it better. This is the framework that talks about bettering the implementation process. So now that we've decided upon videos as our implementation method, how do we make it better? Well, we're in the early stages. This is more of a stay tuned slide rather than a here's what happened slide. Implementation science we discussed. How do we better this implementation process? Right now, this case study will contribute to contextual implementation research, and hopefully that contributes to the global body of knowledge around videos and programming. Once we have enough information, then we can start to build frameworks, tools, and guidelines for using this process in other projects. So stay tuned. Maybe next year we can better present this slide and have some different results, and hopefully we have a success story along the way. So to summarize today, we showcased an alternative method to top-down programming in the face of COVID. Crises tend to shine a light on existing systemic problems while introducing new problems of their own. Programming needs to adapt without a fear of failure or letting down donors. At the same time, it upholds local values and maintains integrity. Bottom-up approaches are more sustainable because they encourage ownership and keep the knowledge within the community. We can no longer accept West knows best mentality and fly in expats as the first solution. How can we all think more thoroughly about the principles and impacts of our efforts in this new age?
So as we conclude, I want to leave you with a quote from Peter Lamago, who is the director of the School for Hope for South Sudan. And Peter says, "Before, it was unthinkable that we can produce our own food from our own soil. The knowledge of conservation agriculture, provisions of nutritious meals, and financial support from Rise Against Hunger has boosted our morale. This is what it means to lift someone up and empower a community and a country to understand and replicate compassionate love." And this can be the result when we have transparent implementation. Next slide.
With that final thought, we want to just say thank you so much to our partners at Love, Audrey Moore and Eugenio Karima. We want to say thank you to our food hero, Peter, who's the school director, and also to our videographer, Keen Wallace, and Language Line Solutions, who provided the translation to our videos. At this time, we'll turn it over to Peggy to lead some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Chelsie and Bryan, for your really wonderful and engaging presentation. Questions are starting to come in, and it will soon be time to hear from the audience. There's still time to type your questions in the question box. I'm keeping track of them, and that's on the control panel. But first, I hope to take the liberty as moderator of posing a few questions of my own. Chelsie and Bryan, I'm curious if this is a temporary response to COVID-19, or do you plan to continue this method after things, quote unquote, return to normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. We really looked at COVID-19 as an opportunity. Like I said earlier, crises tend to just shine a spotlight on existing problems. And we knew that this West knows best approach was already a big problem in programming. So COVID just gave us leeway and freedom to kind of change it up. So we hope that this new philosophy continues long after COVID is gone. And we hope that local focused programming can be the new normal.
So how do you think that the videos will lead to adoption to the target practices.
Bryan?
So one of the ways that we're looking at how these videos can be utilized is actually from the experience that I had when I was in South Sudan. And we did a few activities on the ground and initial transfer of information. And as I had said, I was evacuated right in the middle of my visit there, which meant that we couldn't complete a lot of the work. But even though I had left early, I was receiving WhatsApp messages from Peter and the staff at the school sending me photos of how they had continued the work that we had started while I was there, despite the fact that I had so abruptly left. And seeing the dedication and motivation from the team at the school from just that short period of time of while I was there is one of the reasons why we decided to take this leap of faith, that if we figured out how to make the training virtual, that it would be adopted by the members at the school because of the fact that they were already demonstrating adoption of the early techniques that we shared with them.
Thank you, Bryan. Actually, a question came in related to the videos. Are you making these videos available to other sites or institutions or organizations to create space to be dynamic, especially at the design phase?
I think Bryan and I are both big proponents of open source information. As an industry, I think being protective of resources is counterintuitive, and it kind of goes against what we're trying to do. You know, we're in a field of service and we have huge global goals with complex issues and a lot of players. And the idea that we would protect and keep information secretive or hidden from other people who are on the same team as us, I feel is a little bit silly. Maybe Bryan can speak more to this.
We also operate with the idea that it takes a village. And one of the things that Chelsie and I have been doing is we've actually been looking at local resources available to help us make these videos. For instance, early on, we attempted to partner with a local farm so that we could use space to actually film the videos. We've recently reached out to a South Sudanese youth group to help with translating the videos and also involving them in the process of doing some of the nutrition videos so that we can make sure that we reflect that representation of the communities that we're serving. But in addition to that, we're also Chelsie and I are a small team of technical individuals. So a part of like our beekeeping initiative of the project, we're reaching out to local beekeepers to see if they would also be interested in helping us make these videos. So our effort to make the videos is collaborative in itself. So being able to have the videos, we would also want to be able to share that collaboration and work with other organizations on these ideas and how to create these resources for individuals across the world.
Thanks, Bryan. I really appreciate that because, as you know, for implementation science, some of the key things that we must do is to be flexible and to adapt things as we go along, and that's a great example. Here's a larger question that came in. Did the team use methods from systems thinking or design thinking to guide the design of the intervention?
I love design thinking. It's one of the things I did several extra hours working on during grad school. So yes, I think that philosophy holds true in a lot of my approaches. Human-centered design, design thinking, quality improvement, continuous improvement. These are all things that I'm constantly thinking about as we work through these solutions. And as I kind of talk through our approach to how we got to this idea to do videos, and even just the way that we do videos, you know, looking at the person who's going to be watching them, really taking into consideration their literacy level, their level of motivation. We collected that information, as Bryan said, by going in with these questions, wanting to learn how do you experience these barriers, and how would you like your solutions to be in your own way, you know? And so even just hearing feedback, which was really validating from Peter, the director, just last night, just reinforcing this idea that yes, these videos, while lacking text, are strong in showing the process and the concept, and they're translated to local languages. This is the best method that locals at the school can receive the information so that they can learn the practice best. So yes, we did.
Thanks, Chelsie. It's always a process and a journey. And I'm glad you got great training at UNC so that you could apply some of these strategies, approaches, and so on. I had to put a plug in for UNC. Here's another question that's related to delivery. And considering that behavior change takes much more than just improving knowledge, as we know, what other type of support are you building into your approach and providing to your trainers in South Sudan?
Yeah, absolutely. Behavior change communication is a big component of what we're doing. We didn't go too deeply into it because we wanted to really focus on the videos, but we are also implementing at the school a health club. And this is a way for the children to get involved outside of school hours. And through that, we're actually developing a curriculum. And we're going to be working with the youth group, the South Sudanese youth group, on some of those topics. And I had an intern help me kind of get some more resources and information on general global nutrition topics that we can bring to the school and then personalize and contextualize as we learn. The nice thing is this is a 5-year project and it's a conversation. Bryan and I are really big proponents of this whole thing being relational and not transactional. So it's not that we just go in there and plop a manual into the hands of these kids, but we're working with them to develop a curriculum that is fun, that is engaging, and that really speaks to the way they would want their futures to look so that they're more motivated to keep that knowledge and have this be a more sustainable solution.
Great. So we still have a little bit of time if you would like to send a question in. In the interim, here's another one from me. What are the specific nutrition issues for this project and how does this approach solve them? You showed those slides about meeting nutrient requirements. So talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So we don't know too much about the nutrition status as of now, which is part of the reason we started this project. Those tablets are going to be used for collecting data on the anthropometrics, so the height, the weight, the arm circumference of the children at the school. And this should be done in November, so just this coming month. Once we have that data, we'll have a much more clear idea of where we are so that we can have an idea of where we need to go. We're also planning on doing another nutrition survey that gets more at the heart of dietary diversity and behaviors, taboos, beliefs, in addition to just the nutrition status of the children. And this is what will really inform that behavior change communication component. So it's all connected. You can't really think of it in isolation, but we do know, as we saw from the FuseNet map, that South Sudan is in a stage 3 crisis, and food insecurity would likely be worse if it weren't for foreign aid, like World Food Program and Rise Against Hunger, of course. But this isn't sustainable, so how do we keep it going? Well, the nutrition status of a lot of these kids, they are displaced children with no parents. And Lift Up the Vulnerable has found them and brought them to this school, and it's also an orphanage. So the nutrition status of these kids is not likely to be healthy, I guess, in the context of the entire South Sudan. But we really won't know clearly until next month, but that will inform a lot of our practices, which, as we said, will be adaptive and more specific as we learn new information.
What kind of challenges do you see moving forward, Bryan, for rolling this project out, especially in context of COVID-19, which isn't going anywhere right now? And I actually would also like to know how the pandemic is affecting the population, the community there in South Sudan.
So since COVID-19 has appeared, and after I was being evacuated, the school actually went onto lockdown, so they weren't letting anybody leave or enter the campus unless there was a either emergency situation or there was a need to get something from the local market. And so one of the reasons why they took such a strict stance on this is because, one, there's just not a lot of resources available to support the community and the school. But looking at in terms of some of the challenges that we're seeing with these videos, definitely maintaining the timeline of being able to stay ahead of the curve and film the videos, edit the videos, translate the videos, then have the videos downloaded onto these tablets using questionable, shaky internet connections. Um, and so I think one of the things that's happening is that Chelsie and I have our plan, and we have these different local resources that we're also trying to pull on to help make these videos. And it's just a collaborative effort. One of the things too that we're doing is that we're making sure that we maintain a presence with the agriculture staff, and are in close contact with Peter at the school, and also Eugenio, who is part of Lift Up the Vulnerable and based out of Kenya. He's also helping us facilitate a lot of the conversation in between, so that way we can make sure that we're being attentive, even if we're not able to produce the videos at a high enough volume. But the goal is just try to stay ahead of that curve, make them in batches, and we're just trying to run with this to see if we can make it work.
Mm-hmm. So here's another question that came in. This person said, I like the distinction between static and dynamic implementation practices. Often implementers have to be more static because of predefined outputs, especially those promised to donors as deliverables. So what's the tension for the work that you're doing? And do you have any recommendations based upon experience about any pressures you might be receiving from that side, or has it been pretty smooth sailing?
I really appreciate that question. I myself, being someone who has been an implementer and field worker for the last 7 years in terms of international development, those types of restraints that we have, especially making sure that we reach deliverables, is one of the most stifling components of implementation. Luckily for myself, being a fellow and being able to work with Rise Against Hunger, who is also new in this field of actually implementing these types of agriculture projects, we are looking for ways to really advocate for what it means to implement programs successfully. And so luckily enough, I've had the opportunity to just have that open communication with the team that I work with. And we're also looking at just ways that Rise Against Hunger can make sure that we're fulfilling our mission of creating or supporting communities and becoming self-sustained and not reliant on our meals. So advice that I have, a part of the reason why Chelsie and I decided to even be a part of this webinar is because we do want to spread these ideas and start these conversations about how we can disrupt the current systems of implementation and start advocating for the fact that there's a lot of local knowledge that's going untapped because of the fact that we are so confined to a static implementation and the restraints set by donors. So I don't have a perfect solution for you, but I welcome anyone to help be a part of this conversation that Chelsie and I are trying to start, of figuring out how we can have all forms of implementation, all forms of development be dynamic.
Thanks, Bryan. Chelsie, do you have anything to add to that question? You're relatively new at Rise Against Hunger and being an implementer.
Yeah, I would say my experience so far with Rise has been pretty positive. I think the way that the model is set up, we do have quite a bit of freedom in determining our outputs and changing them as we need to. We definitely still feel that tension and pressure, and it's kind of a perfect leading question into what to do next. So we kind of want to challenge everyone here, and even challenge ourselves, to think about how we can shake it up. How can we progress this industry and not just be stuck in the status quo of, pleasing donors, quote unquote, or sticking to these predetermined outputs?
You're absolutely right, and I think that Rise Against Hunger is extremely fortunate to have both of you. We are just about out of time for more questions, but before I wrap up the webinar, Chelsie and Bryan, could you share with our audience some next steps or action items that they might be able to implement after today's session?
Sure. So from the poll, if you're an implementer or a field worker on the ground, how can you really listen to the locals? How do they experience the barriers? And how can you approach them with more questions than solutions? If you're a researcher or scientist out there, how can you include more diversity in your reporting? How can you share your failures as well as your success? Because it is all important to contributing to the body of knowledge that's out there for us implementers. And how do you maintain practicality in your research? I read a study recently about the health outcomes of early eating versus late eating, but a late eater was defined as someone who ate after 2:30 p.m., which is like everybody. So that's not the most practical research. So how can your research be practical? If you're in policy or government, are you choosing your partners wisely? What are their plans for sustainability? And how will your citizens be better off after these programs are over? If you're a donor, how can you relinquish control? How can you change your financing to fit adaptive programming? When you ask indicators of your program team, are they necessary? And how can you report transparency so that we can continue to learn from each other's success stories and failures? And if you're not involved in international development or implementation science directly, you still play a part in the international food system. It is a complex system. So how do the food choices you make and the dollar choices you make influence that system? Finally, we just want to say, we would love to continue this conversation. My LinkedIn and email is here. Bryan's LinkedIn and email is here. He will have a podcast coming soon called Hidden Development. It really looks at the hidden nuances and impacts that international development agencies have on these communities. So check his LinkedIn for updates on that. But look, we really want this to be a conversation, so don't be afraid to reach out. And if you have criticisms or feedback, we'd love to hear it. This is a collaborative process, and we want to make it better.
Thank you so much, Chelsie and Bryan, and thanks everyone on the webinar, the attendees, for your participation and insightful questions. And if any of your questions were not answered, here you have the contact information to reach out to Chelsie and Bryan, and they will answer them. It has really been a pleasure to moderate this session today. We hope this webinar has been informative and thought-provoking. If you have other questions or comments, please contact the Society at info@implementationnutrition.com. If you have an idea for a webinar that would be beneficial to a CISN audience, we invite you to submit your proposal on the webinar page of the CISN website. Do visit the website to stay up to date on the Society's activities and learn more about implementation science in nutrition and various engagement opportunities available to all members. We're also active on social media and welcome your thoughts, comments, and engagement through our Twitter and LinkedIn page. And please spread the word about CISN with your colleagues who may not join or know about us. We would love that. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a brief survey on the webinar, and we would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email in a few weeks with a link for today's webinar recording and a URL to the PDF of the slides. So on behalf of CISN and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.